Hey everyone, in today's video, I'm going to show you how to build a REST API in Flask using Flask-RESTX. So Flask-RESTX is a library for building APIs in Flask that is actually being updated. So the problem with a lot of Flask extensions is over time, they don't get updated. So oftentimes you want to find one that's actually being maintained, and Flask-RESTX as of today in 2023 is actively maintained. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to use it. And here is the API that we're going to build. So we see all these different things that we can do. First of all, it's going to generate this page for us, this Swagger page. And then I can do stuff like get API courses. I can just hit try it out and execute. And then I see some information here. I can go down to posts. I can add a course to the API or to my system. I can add students, and I can delete them and update them and so on. So I'm going to demonstrate all of this in the video. And if you want further help with building your own API for your project and you don't think this video is enough, feel free to reach out to me directly. I do help people with their projects in a one-on-one situation. I do that through my coaching program. So you can go to prettyprinted.com/coaching or the link in the description below to learn more on how to do that. So with that said, let's get into building this API using Flask-RESTX. To begin, we're going to start with a completely empty project so I can show you everything that needs to be done to get this example up and running. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a virtual environment. So I'll do python-m venv, and then I'll name my virtual environment env. And once it's created, I'll go ahead and activate it with source bin activate. And then I'll install Flask. So pip install Flask. And in addition to Flask, for this example, I want Flask-RESTX. So I'll install that. And I also want Flask SQL Alchemy. So I will install that as well. Okay, so I have those three libraries installed. So now I'll create a directory for my app, and I'll call this just app for the directory. And then inside of that directory, I'm going to create a file called dunder init. And this is where we can set up our Flask app. So I want to import from Flask the Flask class, and I want to create a create app function. I'm going to instantiate Flask in here and simply return the Flask app object at the end here. So this should be enough to run. Since my directory is named app, it should be picked up automatically when I do Flask run. So we see it turns on, but I don't have anything defined on this app. So let's go ahead and stop. Let's install python.env. So pip install python.env. And the reason is I want to create a file in here called Flask-env. And in here, I'll just put Flask debug equals true. You can also put this to 1. Doesn't really matter what the value is as long as it's not 0. So Flask debug equals true. And now when I start my app with Flask run, we see it's in debug mode. Okay, so now that I have this, I want to set up the extensions for Flask-RESTX and SQL Alchemy. So in app, I will create a new file called extensions.py. And from Flask_SQL Alchemy, I'll import the SQL Alchemy class. And then from Flask-RESTX, I'm going to import API. So API is the name of the class in Flask-RESTX that I need to import. And then I can instantiate both. So I can say API equals API and DB equals SQL Alchemy. Then I'll go back to my dunder init and I'll just import them here. So from .extensions, import API and DB. And then I can init app here on both. So API init underscore app, pass in the app object. And then the same thing for DB. So pass in the DB object. So typical stuff if you're doing something with Flask apps. Now I want to put some configuration for my database. So app config, SQL Alchemy database URI, and I'll just use a SQLite database. So SQLite and then 3 slashes, and I'll call this db.sqlite3. And this db.sqlite3 file will end up in an instance folder when I go and create all the models in my app. But before I get to that, I want to show you the first part of Flask-RESTX. So by simply adding this extension API and then initializing the app on it, I can now see Swagger on the home page. So let me go over to my browser and I'll go to localhost 5000. And we get this here on the base URL. So here it says API, and this is just a Swagger page. Doesn't have anything yet because I haven't defined any endpoints, but once I do that, we'll see them here and we'll be able to test everything here. So we don't have to use a tool like Postman necessarily. We can just do everything here. So now let's create the first endpoint that we're going to demonstrate. So what I'll do is I'll create a new file called resources.py. This can be anything you want. This can be routes, views, API, whatever. It depends on how you organize your project. But in my case, I'm just going to call this resources. And then what I want to do is I want to say from Flask-RESTX, I want to import something. So I want to import resource and I want to import namespace. So namespace in this case is going to act like a blueprint in Flask. So it's basically I create the namespace and I'll put my API endpoints on a particular namespace. So you can have as many namespaces as you want. In my case, I'm only going to have one, but you can have as many as you want. So I'm going to call this namespace. So NS for namespace. And then I'm going to instantiate it. And then the first argument is going to be the URL location. So like slash whatever you have here. So what I'll do is I'll have it be /API, and you'll see this in just a moment. But that's all I need to create the namespace. And then I want to define an actual endpoint. So what I can do is I can do @ns. So this is kind of like defining routes in Flask. And then I will call this hello. And then I can define a class underneath this decorator, and I'll call this hello, and it's going to inherit from the resource that I imported here. And then inside of this class, you just define methods for each HTTP method that you want to support. So for this example, I'll just support get. So this is a class, so get will have self. And then I need to return something that's JSON serializable. So I'll return a dictionary, and I will say hello RESTX. Okay. So now with this, I need to register this namespace on the API. So I can go back to dunder.init and from .resources, I'll import NS. And then down here, I'll say API.add namespace NS. Right. So I'll save that. My app will restart. And I'll refresh the page here. Now we see this API here shows up. So this is the namespace. And then we see I have one endpoint defined /API. So that's what I was talking about with the API in the namespace here. Where is it? API there. And then hello is my endpoint. So hello. And then I can open this, hit try it out and execute. And we see down here, it simply returns hello RESTX. So that's exactly what I told it to return. Doesn't do anything special, but that's what I wanted it to return. Okay, so now that we have that simple example out of the way, let's move on to a more realistic one. It's still going to be simple though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some models, and these models will be for keeping data in the database. And then the resources that I define will either grab information from the database or allow the user to add information into the database. So first, what I need to do is I need to create a file called models.py, and this will be for my SQL Alchemy models. So I'll import DB from extensions. So from .extensions import DB, and then I'll create two classes. So this API will be for courses and students enrolled in that course. So we'll create a class called course. It inherits from db.model. Every model needs to have an ID on it. So this will actually be an integer. Primary key is going to be true. And then I'll just copy this and I'll name this student because it's going to be the same start with the ID. And then the course will have a name. So this will be a string, let's say up to 50 characters long. I can put unique equals true. Let's just do that. But this example will be really simple. And then for students, you know, I can do the same thing. So each student will have a name and each course will have a name. And then finally, what I want to do is I want to say that each student can be enrolled in only one course, right? So each course will have a list of students. Each student will belong to just one course in our pretend school here. So what I can do on the student is I can put a foreign key. I'll call this course ID. And this will be db.column db foreign key, and the foreign key is going to be to course.id. And then I can also put the SQL Alchemy relationships on here, so I'll just add those as well. So I'll call one students in the course, so db.relationship to student, and this will back populate a column called, what is it going to be called? It's going to be called course. And then inside of student, I can create a course relationship, db.relationship to course, and this will back populate the students inside of course. Okay, so now that I have those two, I can go to Flask shell and then do db.createAll. And let me go into the database to see if my models are there. They're not there. So what I need to do first is go back to Flask shell. And what I want to do is I want to say from app.models import star. So that will just import both. And then if I do db.createAll, that should work. So now let me try opening the database file. And if I can type tables, now we see course and student are in there. So the reason why I had to import is because I don't have more things set up in my app. If I had something that was imported into Dunder Init that had access to the models, then I wouldn't have to import in Flask shell. But because I don't have that much yet, I had to import them myself inside of Flask shell. So just a minor thing. So now let me go back into the shell and I can import everything again. And what I'll do is I'll create a couple of courses and a couple of students. So course, I'll just do it directly. So db.session add _all. We want to create a course. Name, we'll call this math. So that will be one course. Another course will be called biology. And let's make it a little more generic since I use math. Let's call this science. And then one last course called history. Okay. So I just added those three to the session. And then I can commit these. And I want to add some students as well. So db.session.add all. So student, let's say name is Anthony. And course ID, so which course is Anthony enrolled in, we'll say math. And then I'll just create some more students. So name Brittany, and the course ID will be 1 as well. And then I'll create one last student, name equals Charlie, and course ID equals 2. Okay. So now I can do db.session.commit, exit, and let me just check my database again. So if I select star from student, we see Anthony, Brittany, and Charlie, and then we see 112 for the course ID. And then if I select star from course, we see math, science, and history. So everything is in the database. So now let's set everything up so the API shows this information. So let's go back to resources and let's start with courses. Okay, so now we need to create an endpoint for the list of courses. So we'll call this /courses. Then we need to create a class, and let's call this course API, just so it's not confused with the models.py course. Okay, so course API, it needs to inherit from resource. And then I want to define get. So what I want to do is I want to return basically course.query.all. So let me import that. So from .models import course. I want to return this. So let's give it a shot. Let's start the app and then let's go here. So we can go to API and now we see API/courses appears. So if I try it out here and execute, we see I get this error. And here it says object of type course is not JSON serializable. So what this means is Flask-RESTX doesn't know how to convert the results from this query here into something that can be passed as an API response. So to help Flask-RESTX do this, we have to create something called a model in Flask-RESTX. So this is not to be confused with the models that I have here for Flask SQL Alchemy. This is a different model. So what I'll do is I'll create another file called API_models. And first I'm going to import API from extensions. And I also want to import from Flask-RESTX something called fields. And you know what? Let me move this to the top. Okay. So here I have fields from Flask-RESTX, and I also have the API from extensions that is just API instantiated. So what I want to do is I want to create a model that represents what's supposed to be the structure of a course response. So I'll call this course underscore model. And then this is going to be API.model. So using the API object that I imported. And then I can give it a name. So course. And then a structure. So this is going to be a dictionary. And this is the basic JSON structure that I want. So I want the ID to appear. I want the name of the course to appear. And I want the student to appear, or the students. But for now, I'm going to leave this blank because this is going to require another model for students. And I'll show you how that works when I create the student model. But for now, we'll just focus on the ID and the name. So now I need to say what type is ID. So that's going to be fields.integer. So all the IDs are integers. And then for name, you can probably guess it's going to be a string. So fields.string. So let me go ahead and save that. And then I can go back to my resources and import that. So from.api models, import course model. And then what I want to do is I want to go down to this Git now that I have the course model, and I'm going to decorate Git with something. So it's going to be add ns, and then I want to say Marshall list with, and then course model. So what Marshall means here is it's going to take the return value that I returned from this method here, and it's going to use the model that I passed a Marshall list with to convert that to a list of basically dictionaries that can be JSON serialized and displayed to the user through an API. So now let's go and refresh this, go to API, and then try it out again. And now we see the three courses. So math, science, and history, and we see the IDs for each one. So now let's go ahead and do one for students. So let's create the model first. We'll call this student model, API model, student, and it's going to look exactly the same for now. So fields.integer, and then the name of the student. So fields.string, just like that. And then I can create another resource. I'll call this /students. We'll call this student API. And then it's going to take in or inherit from resource again. I'm going to Marshall list with student model, and I need to import that up here. So student model. I'm going to define the get method and return student.query.all. And I need to import the student model from .models. So now that I've done all that, I can go back to the home page, go to API students, try it out, execute. And now I see the three students that I have in the database. Now let's go back to the part of the model where I can show more information on the course. So like for the course, I can have a list of students, and then for the student, I can have the course that they're enrolled in. So let's start with the student. What I'll do is I'll create another field called course, and a course is simply going to be a nested model. So we'll say fields.nested, and the nested model in this case is going to be the course model. And I need a comma there. So now when I run this again, we see inside of my students, I have the name of the student, and then I have their course information. So we see ID 1 and math. So for each student, I have the course. Now let me comment this out and do students. So I'll go to the course model, and then for this, it's going to be similar, but instead of nested first, it's going to be list. And then inside of that, it's going to be nested. And then it's going to have the student model, right? So if I just move this down so it's defined and put the comma down here because that's missing. Now let's give it a shot. So I'll reload the page. I'll go to courses. I'll execute. And now we see I have the course math, I have the students in that course, science, and then the student in that course. And then for history, there are no students in the course. So the reason why I did it this way is because if I had both at the same time, it would be a bit circular and it would just keep going, like it will keep nesting over and over again. So for our purposes, I'll just leave the students on here. But if you wanted it the other way around, I'll just leave this here. So if you look at the code after this video, you can just use this instead of the nested list here. Okay, so now let's say we wanted to create either a student or a course. Let's go over to resources. And what we can do is we can define another method on either course or students. Let's start with course first. So what I want to do is I want to say post and then self. So the main thing to consider here is the type of data that I'm going to be receiving. So what I can do is I can decorate posts with ns.expects, and then I can pass in the course model. And then I'll just return just an empty dictionary for now. And let's just look at this in Swagger. So let me reload the page. And this should be expect, not expects, singular. And I can see the post here in green. I can open it. And they're showing me what the data is supposed to look like. So when I try it out here, I can pass a course that looks like this. But the problem is this isn't exactly what I want, because when I'm creating a course, the only thing I'm concerned with is the name of the course. The ID is generated in the database, and then the students are added in a separate process. So when I'm creating a course, I just want to be able to pass in the name. So what I can do is I can create another model. So we can call this course input model, and then API model, course input. And then for this, I'll just have name and then fields string. So now let me import this inside of resources. And I can change the expect to be course input model. So now I'll reload the page, go to API courses, and now we see it only expects a name and a string. So now to get that information, what we can do is we can print ns.payload. And I'll show you what that looks like. So if I go back here, go to courses, try it out, test course, and then just hit execute. We see here it has name test course. I accidentally hit it twice, so that's why it shows twice. But we see here that this payload has the information that we want. So what I can do is I can take the information from that payload and create something in the database. So what I'll do is I'll say course equals course. So this is SQL Alchemy again. Name is going to be ns.payload, and then the name value. And then I'll add this to the session. And then I will commit. And for the results, I can pass a second thing to return, which will be the status code for success. So 201 is generally when you create something new. So I'll put 201 there. And then for the actual data here, what I can do is I can return course. And here I can do ns.marshal with. So instead of marshal list with, just marshal with by itself, and course model. And this will return the data from the database, right? So it's going to have both an ID that is generated by the database. It's also going to have a list of students, which will be empty to begin with. So let's go back and let's go to API and let's create a new course. So try it out here. And this course will be, so I have history, science, math. What's another course? Reading. So we'll execute. We get an error. DB is not defined, so that's a very easy error to deal with. I'll just say from dot extensions import DB. And then we can just try again, execute. And now we see the response. So ID is 4, so it's the 4th course to be added. The name of the course is reading, and we see there are no students in the course. So we can do the exact same thing for a student. So let's go ahead and create the input model first. So I'll just copy this. and I'll call this student input model. We'll call this student input. And in addition to the name, I want to pass the course ID. So we'll say fields dot integer for that. And then I can go back to resources and then import that. So student input model. And for this one, I'm going to do ns.expect student input model, and then ns.marshal with the regular student model. And then I can define my post method here. So posts with self, and it's going to follow the same pattern. So let me remove this print for the payload, and I can just create a student. So student equals student. The name will be ns.payload name, and the course ID will be ns.payload course underscore ID, just like that. And then I can add the student to the session, and then I can commit db session commit, and then I can return the student and 201 because I'm marshaling with the student model, so I can just return the student object. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's go back here. Now we see we have posts for students. I'll try it out. So I'll create a new student, and we'll call this student Desiree. And the course ID that she'll be in is course ID 4. So let's go ahead and execute this. Get an error. Unique constraint failed. I think I hit it twice again. So let's see. If I go back to students here, so get for all the students, try it out, execute. Yeah, we see here that Desiree is in a list of students. And then for courses, get courses. Try it out here. We see that reading has Desiree in the course. So yeah, I just hit it twice down here when I went to create the student. So the first time the student was created successfully, but the second time I had the same name again. So the unique constraint failed. So that's not really a problem. I just have to make sure I don't hit the button twice. Okay, so we have the lists endpoints for both courses and students. Now let's think about what happens when we want to work on a single thing. What we can do is, let's start with course. We can create another resource. So ns routes, and this one will be courses / and then an ID. So int ID, just like that. And then what I'll do is I'll name this one course API, and I'll name this one course list API, just to make them a little different. So this will inherit from resource. And then I can just do the same thing. So I want to return like one course instead of all of them. So first I'll marshal with. So this is just marshal with because I'm returning one thing, not a list. So marshal with the course model. And then I can define the get method. And what I want to do is I want to get that from the database. So I can say course equals course query filter by. And you know what? I don't even need filter by. I can just use get. So get, and then this will take in an ID. So after self, I just pass an ID because I have the ID here. So these need to match. And then I can pass the ID to get. And then I can return course just like that. And because it's marshaled with the course model, that will work. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. Let's refresh Swagger, go to get course ID. And then here, I can just pass in an ID when I hit try it out. So let's say ID number 2, hit execute, and we see I get the science course only. I don't see the other courses, just science, and I still see that Charlie is enrolled in the science course. And of course, I can do the same thing for student. So I'll just copy this, and I'll put it down here. And like I said, I can make this student list API, and then this just will be student API. I'm going to change this to students, and then I'm going to marshal with the student model. And then instead of course, I'm querying student, and then just returning the student there. So let me just copy that, and all of that should work. So let's go to Swagger, refresh, go to students, or just student for 1. And then we want student ID 1. execute, and we see Anthony is the name here. So there are two other methods that are typically supported in REST APIs. We already have get and post. There are two gets, one for a single item and one for a list. But on the single item, there are two other things that we can do. So we can update something that already exists, and that's usually with put or patch, and then we can delete something. So what I'll do is I'll do put, and that will be for updating a student, right? So we're going to pass in a student ID as well, and we'll just change the name of the student as an example. Or actually, let's just change the course that they're enrolled in, or we can do both, the student name and the course that they're enrolled with. So we're going to marshal with a student model again, and then we're going to define the put method this time, and it's going to take in an ID, and then I can query for that student. And we're going to accept some request data. So once again, we're going to use expect. So I can do ns.expect and then student input model again. And then I just want to update the database with those values. So we have student.name is going to be equal to ns payload name. And then student.course ID is going to be updated with the course ID that is passed. I can do db session commit, and then I can return the student, and I can return, let's just say 200. Okay. So now let's go back and let's look at student number 1 first. So now we see the orange one, but let's look at student number 4. So student number 4 is Desiree. And by looking at the courses, we know that Desiree is in course number 4, so the reading course. So let's go ahead and update Desiree. So let's go to API students. We'll try it out. And we need to pass an ID for the student. So we want to update student 4, so Desiree. And we're going to change her name to be Debbie. And then we're going to change the course that she's enrolled in from reading to math, so number 1. So let's go ahead and execute. And we see we have ID 4 and Debbie. Now let's go back up to the list of courses. And now we see in math, we have Anthony, Brittany, and now Debbie is in this course. And if we go to reading, we see that there are no students left in the course. So now for the last one, we want to delete. So what we can do is we can define the delete method. So this is going to take in the ID as well. And then what I want to do is I want to query for that. So we can do student equals student.query.get ID. There are a couple ways of deleting things, but I'll just use this approach. And then we can do db.session.remove. And then we can do db.session commit. So we can remove someone. And then because we can't return the student information anymore because they're gone, we'll just return an empty dictionary. And I believe the code is 204, but I'm not quite sure, but we'll just leave it as 204. And if you figure out the right code, you can always change this to something else. So let's go over to Swagger again. And now we see in red, I have the delete, and I'll try it out and I'll just pass an ID 4, run this, and we get an error and it says remove isn't correct. That's because this should be delete, not remove. So let me just change that to delete, and then we can run this again. And now we see 204 is the response code, and there are no errors. So if I go to the list of students now, so API students, the GET requests, and run this, I now see just Anthony, Brittany, and Charlie. Like Debbie is no longer there because I deleted ID number 4. So that's it. What I want to do is I'll simply just copy and paste these for the course, just in case you wanted to see them, but the idea is exactly the same. So let me just change everything here. So this will be the course input model. And then this will be marshaled with the course model here. And then the put is the same, but this is going to query course. We'll call this course. And then we can only change the name of the course. So we don't need anything for the course ID. And then we can commit it and return course just like that. And then for student here, on the delete, this will be course. We're going to query the course model, pass in the course to delete, and then there's nothing to return. So that's it for this API. Those are all of the endpoints that I wanted to create and show you how to to work with in Flask-RESTX. So obviously there's much more you can do in Flask-RESTX. You can add more documentation to Swagger here so it's more clear on what each thing is supposed to do. I didn't do that in this video, but that is an option. And of course, there are some other features that you can use when it comes to building your APIs. But I hope I was able to give you a good introduction to Flask-RESTX in this video. So if you wanted to use it in your projects, you will know how to use it. So if you have any questions about anything that I've done here, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time.